Okay, this is going to be an odd one. There's a comic author and editor named Esther Friesner, who I've read off and on for quite some years. Now, there are a couple... No, there is going to be censored as much as necessary, by the way. As an editor, she's a very good editor, and she's been very proficient in finding female comic fantasy authors and just women authors in general in the fantasy field, which are frequently underrepresented, and focusing on the more interesting ones of those as well. So, kudos to her on that, and I really respect her for those efforts. She's also been one of the leaders in that field, especially since she started doing that in the 80s and 90s, when, let's just say, fantasy and science fiction were much more, massively bigoted than they are now. So, good for her. Why am I reviewing her, though? Well, the thing is Friesner also writes comic fantasy. And the comic fantasy she writes is of an interesting variety, which was much more common in the 80s and 90s than it is currently. It was, actually, from the 50s on, through to the 90s, until you get the great digital publishing revolution of the aughts. See, Friesner operated, like so many of these people, out of New York, with a very New York-centric attitude. Her humor was very much Borscht Belt style, and required knowing a lot of ins and outs of the New York metro area in order to fully get all the jokes. As a youngster who had been to New York once and had little to no desire to repeat the experience, and the more I learn about it, the more friends I make who live there, the less I want to actually go there and convince them to come live in a civilized place, like literally everywhere else in the country. The less I am able to, look away from all this in-jokes, which are just so amazingly not clever at all. And they frequently are used by many of the best authors, because the thing is the publishing industry was so heavily located in New York State, specifically New York City, that there really wasn't any other voice available. So, occasionally you get something out of like Boston, or in the case of Lovecraft, out of Providence, Rhode Island, the New England style. But Southern voices, black voices, Midwestern voices especially, all those were lost. And yes, we'll look over here while he's eating that, and I pull him away from that. Okay, so back to Friesner and the shtick she's pulling. And that's the thing, it's just shtick. It's like she learned a specific set of stock jokes, and they are stock jokes. They're used constantly by the same set of authors from the same perspective. And again, it's very Borscht Belt. You could hear Groucho Marx making similar jokes in the 30s, really. And when Marx did them, they were only 40 years out of date. Nowadays, when Friesner was writing in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, there's so much more so. Some of them, these jokes, are reference ideas and concepts which are important only to events that happened 100 years ago, and very temporary ones at that. So that really detracts from someone who is otherwise a very good author, and as I said, did a great job in getting more female voices into fantasy and science fiction. So, why do I come down on this? Because there's a strong tendency to speak to the parochial in fantasy and science fiction. That is, the things which everybody assumes are shared knowledge. And this sort of New Yorker shtick assumes that these experiences are general, when in fact they're so amazingly small town. I mean, I've lived in small towns, I've lived in large towns, and I can't imagine anything more small town than a New Yorker talking about New York to other non-New Yorkers as if everybody knows what they're talking about. It's the rough equivalent, it's the artistic equivalent of saying in order to get to Bob's house, you drive past the where the old train house used to be, and then you take a left where that movie theater once showed Jaws and then got banned from showing anything by Spielberg ever again by the angry mom. You remember her. Yeah, and he's near her house too. So that's pretty much the way I view these sorts of things, and I think it's an accurate viewpoint. I mean, London is a global city as well, and London, at least, is a much, much larger city, and one which has an inherent consistency within the English language, because let's face it, modern English stems from Shakespeare and Marlowe, so we kind of have to deal with that. New York, on the other hand, is just yet another American city, albeit, oh, for crying out loud, well, albeit a rather large one. And at this day and age, there's really nothing it has to set it aside besides a similar unique culture that other large cities have. Chicago, Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, all of which are just as, if not more, interesting. So, we have many smaller cities like Detroit are vastly more interesting. So, Friesner makes this mistake. Her works, on the whole, are fundamentally well researched. I mean, to an incredibly intricate level. And they make jokes when they aren't being shticky that reference 4 or 5 different pieces of work and are very intricate. It frustrates me, though, that she retreats to the simple thing, and every time, and that is just, I think, an example of the genre she was working with at the time. Not the genre of fantasy and science fiction, but the genre of the publishing industry at the time. I would like to recommend her work, and if you can stand that sort of hyper shtick, think of like Seinfeld, except, actually just think of Seinfeld, the early seasons, not the ones you remember, but like the first season, which no one watched. And that's pretty much what it is. You almost have to skip pages, but doing so makes you lose plot points. So, I don't know. So this has been my general rant about the parochialism of New Yorkers and the New York publishing industry. I really think that there's a lot of value to what she did as an editor. I think that because I can turn that off, I can see the value of what she's done as a writer. But if you can't, don't bother. This has been Joseph Cadotte for Old Sins Reviews. I'll talk to you later.